She fired him in front of the entire company on her very first day as CEO. And 48 hours later, she was standing at his apartment door, begging him to come back. Ethan Cole hadn't slept in 2 days. He'd been quietly holding the entire company together with bare hands and borrowed time, fighting a cyberattack that no one else even knew existed. And when Victoria Sterling walked in that morning, fresh off a private jet and ready to prove she was untouchable, she looked at the exhausted man slumped over his keyboard and saw exactly one thing: weakness. She had no idea she was looking at the only person standing between her company and total collapse. If you want to see how one decision nearly destroyed a billion-dollar empire, and what it cost both of them to survive it, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The server room on the 14th floor of Meridian Financial Technologies had a smell that most people never noticed. Cold recycled air, something faintly metallic, and underneath it all, the low electrical hum of machines processing more money in a single hour than most Americans would see in a lifetime. Ethan Cole had spent enough time in that room to stop noticing the smell years ago. Tonight, like most nights when something was quietly going wrong, he noticed it again. It was 2:17 in the morning. He was alone. That wasn't unusual. The overnight security team did their rounds on a 40-minute loop, nodded at him through the glass partition, and went back to watching whatever was streaming on their phones. The actual engineers, the ones who were supposed to be on call, had stopped treating late-night alerts as emergencies sometime around the 3rd year after nothing genuinely catastrophic had happened on their watch. They'd text Ethan. He'd handle it. They'd go back to sleep. That had become the unspoken arrangement, and Ethan had let it happen because fighting it required energy he didn't have. He had a daughter to get home to by 7. That was the only deadline that actually mattered. But right now, at 2:17 in the morning, staring at a network monitoring dashboard that was showing him something that made his stomach feel like it had dropped 6 floors, Ethan understood with absolute clarity that 7 o'clock was going to come and go without him. He pulled up the incident log on his secondary monitor and scrolled back through the last 4 hours of traffic data. What he was seeing didn't look like an attack. That was the problem. It looked like normal system behavior. Routine handshake protocols, standard data packet routing, the kind of background noise that automated monitoring systems were specifically calibrated to ignore. Ethan had written 2 of those monitoring systems himself. He knew exactly what they were built to overlook. And someone else knew too. He sat back in his chair and rubbed both hands over his face. His eyes felt like they'd been scraped out with sandpaper. He'd been in the office since 6 the previous morning, nearly 20 hours, troubleshooting a completely unrelated database migration that had gone sideways in 3 different ways simultaneously. He'd planned to leave by midnight. He'd been almost to the elevator when something made him pull out his phone and check the secondary alert channel one more time. Just a habit. A stupid, exhausting, borderline compulsive habit that his therapist, back when he'd had time to see a therapist, had gently suggested might be worth examining. The alert had been minor. A single flag data packet with a slightly irregular header signature. The kind of thing that got logged automatically and reviewed the next morning by someone 3 pay grades below Ethan, who would have marked it resolved without looking twice. Ethan had looked twice. He'd been looking ever since. What he was piecing together, line by line through 4 hours of traffic logs, was the early signature of a supply chain intrusion. The kind of attack that didn't break down the front door but instead spent weeks quietly rearranging the furniture inside, learning the layout, testing which floorboards creaked, waiting for exactly the right moment to make its move. Whoever was behind this wasn't in a hurry. They were patient, and very, very good. Ethan picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb, the head of the IT security division, knowing before the line connected exactly how this conversation was going to go. Marcus picked up on the 4th ring. His voice had the thick, muffled quality of someone surfacing from deep sleep. "Ethan, it's 2 in the morning. I know, I need you to look at something." A pause. Sheets rustling. "Can it wait until—" "No." Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus sighed in the specific way he always sighed when Ethan called him at unreasonable hours. The sigh that said, "You better be right about this. Send me the log file." Ethan sent it. He waited 6 minutes. He knew, because he watched the clock on his monitor, count them off one by one, while he started building the first layer of what he was already thinking of as a containment structure, a series of temporary routing rules that would essentially create a walled-off shadow network, mirroring the real infrastructure while cutting the attacker off from anything that actually mattered. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Looks like noise to me. Go home, Ethan." Ethan stared at the text for a moment. Then he set his phone face down on the desk and kept working. Matsum. By 4 in the morning, he'd confirmed enough to be certain. By 5, he'd built the first containment layer and was starting on the second. By 6, he'd sent formal written alerts to Marcus, to the Chief Information Security Officer, whose name was Derek Paulson, and who had a reputation for taking credit for other people's work, and to the General Operations inbox that theoretically went to someone in senior management. He'd never been entirely sure who actually read it. None of them responded. At 6:45, Ethan called his neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Huang, who was 71 years old and had an arrangement with Ethan that involved a spare key, a standing offer to make pancakes, and the understanding that sometimes his job created complications that didn't fit neatly into a normal schedule. "Lily's already up," Mrs. Huang told him before he could say anything. "She made her own breakfast, toast with peanut butter. She's very proud of herself." Ethan pressed his forehead against the cool surface of his monitor. "I'm so sorry. I'm going to try to get out of here by—" "Don't make promises you can't keep, sweetheart. We'll be fine. Lily wants to know if you're okay." He could hear his daughter's voice in the background, the bright particular quality of it that could cut through any amount of noise or exhaustion and land directly somewhere behind his sternum. "Tell her I'm fine," Ethan said. "Tell her I'll be home soon." He wasn't sure either of those things was true. Meridian Financial Technologies occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago that had been designed to make people feel small in exactly the kind of way that suggested money and permanence. The company processed payment transactions for roughly 40,000 small and medium-sized businesses across North America. Everything from restaurant chains to regional healthcare providers to a surprisingly large number of independent veterinary clinics. Most of the people running those businesses had no idea that Meridian existed. Their customers had even less idea. The money just moved, invisibly and reliably, the way water moved through pipes inside walls. When the pipes worked, Ethan had come to Meridian 6 years ago as a senior network architect, which was a title that sounded significant until you understood that Meridian's hierarchy was approximately 17 layers deep, and that senior network architect put him somewhere in the middle, respected enough to be left alone but not important enough to be genuinely listened to. He'd been fine with that arrangement. He wasn't interested in executive politics. He was interested in making sure the infrastructure worked. What he had not anticipated when he accepted the job was how thoroughly he would come to understand the company's systems, not just his own area, but everything, the whole interconnected architecture of it, the way each component depended on and affected every other component. He'd learned it partly out of professional necessity and partly out of the particular kind of obsessive curiosity that had always made him difficult to work with and, occasionally, genuinely irreplaceable. His personnel file, he knew, contained both of those assessments. The company had gone through 3 CEOs in 6 years. The first had been forced out over a procurement scandal. The second had lasted 18 months before leaving for a competitor. The third, Gerald Whitmore, 63 years old, a careful political operator who had understood instinctively that Meridian's technical infrastructure was more complicated than he would ever fully grasp, and had therefore left people like Ethan largely alone, had announced his retirement 2 months ago. The announcement of his successor had come the following week. Victoria Sterling, age 30, daughter of Harrison Sterling, who had been one of Meridian's original board members and who had quietly accumulated enough influence over the company's governance structure that, when he decided his daughter was ready for her first major executive role, the board had apparently not felt positioned to disagree. She'd had real experience. That was the thing people kept saying whenever the appointment came up in conversation, and the emphasis they put on real suggested they were anticipating the need to defend it. Stanford MBA, 2 years at a venture capital firm. A stint running the digital operations division of a financial services company in Boston that had by most accounts gone reasonably well. None of that was nothing. Ethan wasn't dismissive of credentials. But there was a particular kind of thing you learned about a company only by living inside it for years, and no credential covered that. He'd kept that thought to himself. The morning of Victoria Sterling's first official day as CEO of Meridian Financial Technologies, Ethan Cole had been awake for 41 hours. He was aware of this the way you became aware of extreme physical states, not as a specific number, but as a texture, a kind of grinding friction behind everything, the feeling that his thoughts were being processed through some mechanism that needed maintenance. He'd had 4 cups of coffee since midnight. He'd eaten a vending machine granola bar at some point. He'd removed his jacket and loosened his tie hours ago, and somewhere in the night had pushed both to a corner of his workstation where they'd formed a kind of nest. The attack was still happening. He'd managed to contain it. The containment structure he'd built over the previous 20 hours was holding, but holding the way a dam holds when the water level is still rising. Functional, for now, dependent on no one touching anything. That was the critical thing. Nobody could touch the system until he'd had time to sleep, come back, and properly dismantle the attacker's access points. The containment was temporary, and it was fragile, and it was built on a specific understanding of how the attacker was moving through the network. If anyone restarted the system, which was the standard IT protocol response to almost any anomaly, the containment structure would collapse, and the attacker would have unobstructed access to the payment processing core. Ethan had written this down. He'd written it in the incident log, in an email to Marcus and Derek Paulson, in a note he'd physically taped to the primary operations console. He'd written it clearly and specifically, and with the kind of emphasis that he hoped communicated. This is not me being cautious. This is me telling you something will break. He'd also, somewhere around 4 in the morning, made the mistake of putting his head down on his folded arms for what he'd intended to be 5 minutes. That was the position Victoria Sterling found him in at 8:23 in the morning. Ethan became aware of her presence the way you become aware of sudden quiet. Something changed in the atmosphere of the room, a shift in the particular background noise of a space, and his brain registered it before he was fully conscious. He raised his head. The woman standing in front of his workstation was someone he'd never seen before, which meant nothing on its own. Meridian employed over 400 people across the Chicago office alone, and Ethan's world was primarily the 14th floor and the server room 2 floors below. But there was something about the way she was standing, the particular quality of stillness in it, that told him immediately she wasn't someone who worked in operations. She was dressed in a dark suit with the kind of fit that suggested either significant money or significant attention to detail, and in her case it was probably both. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a way that looked efficient rather than careful. She was maybe 30, possibly younger. She had the kind of face that was hard to read quickly, composed in a way that didn't look practiced, which was unusual in Ethan's experience of people in expensive suits. Behind her stood 3 other people, 2 men in their 40s who had the body language of people who had been told to follow and had accepted that instruction. A woman closer to 50 holding a tablet and wearing an expression of mild but sustained alertness. Ethan looked at them. He looked back at the woman in front. "You're Victoria Sterling," he said. It came out slightly flatter than he intended, not rude exactly, just the voice of someone whose brain was running on fumes. Something shifted in her expression. "Not much. And you are?" "Ethan Cole, Senior Network Architect." He straightened in his chair, aware suddenly of what he must look like. Unshaven, jacket in a heap, eyes that probably looked like he'd been crying even though he hadn't. "I've been here all night. There's an active security incident I need to brief someone on." "I can see you've been here all night." Her voice was even and unhurried. It was the voice of someone who had decided something already. "That's not a compliment." Ethan stopped. "This is the operations center," she continued, and she was looking at him the way you looked at something that had been left somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. Not a hotel, not a break room. She glanced at the jacket in the corner, at the empty coffee cups, at the granola bar wrapper. "How long exactly have you been at this workstation?" "About," he started to calculate, 40 hours roughly. "But there's a reason. I really need you to hear this before 40 hours. She repeated it without inflection. "Sitting at your desk." "Working," Ethan said. "I've been working." There's an active intrusion into the payment network. I've been containing it manually since 2 this morning because I couldn't get anyone from the security team to... Mr. Cole. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Do you understand where we are right now? He looked at her. 14th floor operations center, Meridian Financial. It's my first day, she said. I walked into this building 40 minutes ago. I walked through this floor and the first thing I saw... She gestured at him, a brief, precise movement. Was an employee asleep at his workstation. I wasn't, he started, in front of my entire welcoming party. She said it quietly, and that quietness was somehow worse than if she'd raised her voice. In front of the board members who came to observe my first morning. In front of the team I'm supposed to be leading. Ethan was aware of something loosening at the center of his chest. Not the anger that would have been more useful right now, but something more complicated. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been doing the right thing in the right way and was watching it collapse into the wrong shape. Ms. Sterling, he said carefully, I understand how this looks, but I need 60 seconds of your time to explain what's happening with the network before you make any decisions about... I've already made my decision, she said. The room was quiet. People had stopped pretending not to listen. You're being let go, Mr. Cole, effective immediately. She said it the way you said something you'd already processed. Not cruel, just final. Security will escort you out. HR will contact you about your severance package. For a moment, Ethan just sat there. He was aware of the monitors around him, the screens showing the network traffic he'd been watching for the past 20 hours, the containment structure he'd built that was holding right now and would keep holding until someone who didn't understand it touched it. Don't restart the system, he said. She looked at him. That's all I'm asking. He stood up slowly, the kind of slow that was mostly his legs not cooperating. Whatever you decide about me, fine. But do not restart the system. I've left notes on the primary console. There's an active intrusion and the containment I set up will collapse if anyone... Thank you, Mr. Cole. The woman with the tablet had stepped slightly forward, which was apparently the signal that this conversation was finished. Ethan looked at Victoria Sterling for a moment longer. She was already looking at something on her own phone. He picked up his jacket. He picked up his badge, then set it back down on the desk, because he supposed he didn't need it anymore. He walked to the elevator with 2 members of the building's security team, not because they were restraining him, but because that was apparently the process, and he let them walk him out. And the whole time he was thinking about the containment structure, about the specific configuration of routing rules he'd set up, about the 3.5-page document he'd left on the primary console explaining exactly what to do and exactly what not to do. The elevator doors closed. The lobby was bright and wide and full of morning light. Ethan walked through the glass doors and out onto the sidewalk and stood there for a moment in the cold Chicago air, and then he pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Huang and told her he was on his way home. Huang. Lily was at the kitchen table with a book when he came in, because she was a 7-year-old who read at roughly a 5th grade level and seemed to regard this as a natural and unremarkable fact about herself. She looked up when he came through the door, and her face did the thing it did, that quick, particular readjustment that he'd been watching for 2 years now, and that he understood to be his daughter deciding how worried to be. You look really bad, she said. Thank you, Lily. Like really bad, Dad. She put down her book. Did something happen? He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, which took some effort because his legs were still not entirely cooperative, and he looked at his daughter, who was 7 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and his tendency toward directness and a way of looking at the world that still occasionally caught him off guard. I lost my job today, he said. She processed this with the particular seriousness that she applied to new information. Lost it like you misplaced it, or lost it like it's gone? Gone. Because you were sleeping at work? He looked at her. Who told you? Nobody. You have your sleeping at work face. She paused. You always fall asleep when something's really wrong and you're trying to fix it. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Is the thing still wrong? She asked. Yeah, he said quietly. The thing is still wrong. Lily considered this. She picked up her book, then set it down again. Do you need to fix it? I don't work there anymore. That's not what I asked. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything look too honest. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in November, being gray and cold and indifferent and somehow still, in its particular way, beautiful. "I don't know yet," he said finally. Lily accepted this. She picked up her book again. After a moment, she said, without looking up, "Mrs. Huang made extra pancakes. They're on the stove." He slept for 4 hours and woke up still feeling like something had been scraped out of him, but at least the grinding friction in his thoughts had settled into something more functional. He showered. He ate the pancakes, which were cold by now, and still good. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his personal laptop and thought about what he'd built on that 14th floor, running the calculations in his head, trying to determine how long the containment structure would hold before it either decayed on its own or someone touched something they shouldn't. He estimated 12 hours from the time he'd left, maybe 14 if no one interfered with the system at all. He'd left around 9. It was now almost 2 in the afternoon, which meant that assuming no one had restarted anything, and he'd been very clear about the restarting, he had somewhere between 7 and 11 hours before the situation became critical. He opened his laptop and pulled up the external monitoring access he still technically had. His credentials hadn't been revoked yet, which was common in rapid terminations where HR hadn't caught up to operations, and he started watching the traffic data from outside the building. For the first 20 minutes, everything looked stable. His containment was holding. The attacker was still present in the shadow network but contained, probing the walls he'd built, finding them solid. Then, at 2:34 in the afternoon, Ethan watched the network traffic do something it should not have done. Someone had restarted the system. He sat back in his chair and looked at the screen and felt something cold move through his chest. Not surprise, exactly. He'd warned them. He'd warned them specifically and repeatedly, and in writing and in person, and they'd done it anyway, because that was what happened when people with the authority to make decisions didn't have the knowledge to understand what those decisions meant. On the screen, the traffic patterns were already shifting. The attacker had noticed. Ethan looked at the data for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb. Marcus answered on the second ring this time, which told Ethan something. "Ethan," Marcus started. "Someone restarted the system." A pause. It was standard protocol. There was a directive to run diagnostics on everything as part of the... "Marcus." Ethan kept his voice level. "Is it happening?" Another pause, longer. In the background, he could hear what sounded like raised voices. "We're seeing some anomalies in the..." "It's not anomalies. The containment is gone. The attacker has direct access to the payment processing core right now." He said it carefully, the way you said something to someone who needed to understand it clearly and quickly. "You have maybe 2 hours before they start moving money. Maybe less. Ethan, you don't work here anymore." "I know." He looked at the screen. "I know I don't. I'm telling you anyway because 40,000 businesses are going to have their payment systems fail tonight if you don't." He stopped. He thought about Lily at the kitchen table. He thought about her asking, "Is the thing still wrong?" "Get someone into the server room. Don't touch the primary routing table. Don't run any automated recovery scripts. And call me back in 10 minutes. He ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his coffee, which had gone cold, and at the laptop screen, which was showing him the early stages of a catastrophic infrastructure failure that was happening in a building he no longer had any legitimate reason to enter. From the other room, he could hear Lily reading aloud to herself, which she did sometimes when she thought no one was listening, this low, focused murmur, working through words she wasn't sure of, sounding them out with the particular concentration of someone who took difficult things seriously and didn't expect them to be easy. He thought, she gets that from her mother. He thought, and she gets the other part from me. He looked at the screen. He picked up his phone. He started doing the math on how long it would take him to get back downtown. Marcus called back in 8 minutes, not 10, which told Ethan the situation on the 14th floor had already moved past the point where anyone felt comfortable taking their time. "It's bad," Marcus said. The background noise had gotten louder. Keyboards, overlapping voices, someone calling out numbers that Ethan recognized as error codes from the payment processing layer. "We're seeing transaction failures across the board. Not everything, but it's spreading. The automated recovery system keeps trying to run, and every time it does, the failures get worse. Because the automated recovery is exactly what the attacker wants it to do, Ethan said. He was already moving, carrying his phone to the bedroom, pulling a clean shirt off a hanger. Every time that script runs, it's opening a door. Stop it! Kill the automated recovery completely, and don't let it restart. I don't have authorization to— Marcus. Ethan pulled the shirt on one-handed. Who in that building right now actually understands what's happening? A pause that lasted just long enough to be an answer. That's what I thought. So either you get authorization in the next 10 minutes, or you just do it and explain later, because if that recovery script runs 3 more times, you're going to lose the payment processing core entirely. And then we're not talking about a bad afternoon, we're talking about a federal incident. He grabbed his jacket from the chair by the door. I'm coming in. You can't come in. You don't have credentials anymore. Then someone better meet me in the lobby. He was already moving through the apartment. 15 minutes. He stopped at the kitchen doorway. Lily was still at the table, book open, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was watching him with the careful attention she used when she was trying to understand something she didn't have all the information for. I have to go back, he said. She looked at him for a moment. To fix it? Yeah. Even though they fired you? He didn't have a clean answer to that. He stood in the doorway holding his jacket and looked at his daughter and tried to come up with something that was both honest and appropriately simple for a 7-year-old. And what he arrived at was, the problem doesn't know I got fired. Lily appeared to consider this seriously. Then she nodded, the way she nodded when something made sense to her, even if it didn't necessarily make her happy. Mrs. Huang can stay with me? I already called her. She's on her way up. Lily looked back at her book. Okay. Then quietly, without looking up, be careful. He wanted to say something back that matched the weight of it, but Mrs. Huang was already knocking at the door, and the clock in his head was counting down. And so he said, I will. And he kissed the top of her head, and he left. The cab ride downtown took 19 minutes in traffic that felt personally hostile. Ethan spent the time on his phone, pulling up every external monitoring feed he still had access to, watching the network traffic maps update in near real time, trying to track where the attacker was moving now that the containment was gone. What he was seeing was controlled and methodical. That was the worst part of it. Whoever was running this operation wasn't panicking or rushing now that they had access. They were moving carefully, the way a surgeon moves, precise and unhurried, doing things in a specific sequence that suggested a plan worked out well in advance. They were mapping the internal architecture of the payment processing core, tracing the pathways between systems, looking for the most efficient route to the transaction authorization layer. Once they found that route and planted what Ethan suspected they were going to plant, a small, nearly invisible piece of code that would redirect a fraction of a percent of each transaction to an external account, it would be almost impossible to find without knowing exactly what you were looking for. The theft would be slow and diffuse, and by the time anyone noticed the discrepancies, months would have passed and the money would be gone. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was a long game. Someone had spent weeks or months setting this up, and Ethan's 48 hours of emergency containment had delayed them, but not stopped them, and now that delay was over. The cab pulled up in front of the Meridian Tower at 2:58 in the afternoon. Ethan paid and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the glass facade of the building, and for a brief, strange moment, he felt the full weight of what the morning had been. The humiliation of it, the specific exhaustion of being dismissed in front of a room full of people by someone who hadn't asked a single question, and he let himself feel it for exactly as long as he could afford to. Then he went inside. Marcus was waiting in the lobby, which Ethan had not fully expected. Marcus Webb was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with a hairline in permanent retreat and the kind of baseline anxiety that expressed itself as constant low-level motion. He was always shifting his weight, checking his phone, adjusting his collar. Right now he was doing all 3 simultaneously. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said. And there was something in how he said it, a slight stiffness, like a man who understood he was not entirely comfortable with what he was asking, that Ethan registered and set aside for later. "Where is she?" Ethan asked. "Operations floor. She's been there since—" Marcus stopped. "Since about 40 minutes after you left, actually. She got the first failure reports around 10:30. Ethan started toward the elevator. Has anyone told her what's actually happening? Derek Paulson has been briefing her. Ethan stopped walking. He turned and looked at Marcus. Derek Paulson has been briefing her. Marcus had the grace to look slightly pained. He's the Chief Information Security Officer. Derek Paulson thinks a supply chain attack is something that happens when the delivery trucks are late. Ethan turned back to the elevator and pressed the button. What has he told her? That it's a routine server anomaly, that the automated recovery protocols should resolve it within the hour. The elevator arrived. Ethan stepped in. How many transactions have failed in the last 2 hours? Marcus stepped in beside him. About 12,000. What's the aggregate dollar value? We're still calculating, but preliminary estimates. Marcus glanced at his phone. Somewhere around $40 million in delayed or failed transactions. Ethan looked at the floor numbers ticking upward. It's going to get worse. I know. Derek Paulson doesn't know that. I know that too. The elevator reached 14. The doors opened onto a floor that sounded completely different than it had at 8 in the morning. The low professional hum of ordinary operations had been replaced by something tighter and more urgent. Overlapping conversations, the specific percussion of a lot of keyboards being used fast. 2 separate phone calls happening simultaneously that both involved people saying the words "we're working on it" in tones that did not suggest confidence. Ethan stood in the elevator doorway for a moment, taking in the room, running through it the way he always ran through a problem space, quickly, systematically, mapping what he was seeing against what he already knew. He saw Derek Paulson at the center of the room, standing with his arms crossed and his feet apart in the stance of a man who wanted to look like he had the situation under control. He saw the primary operations console, where 3 engineers were running what looked like. His stomach tightened. Another automated diagnostic sequence. He saw the network monitoring station, where the traffic maps were showing him in about 3 seconds everything he'd spent 20 minutes processing on his phone. And he saw Victoria Sterling. She was standing at the far end of the room near the window wall, not in the center of it, which surprised him. She had her arms crossed, but it didn't look like Derek Paulson's crossed arms. It looked like someone holding themselves together. She was on the phone, her back half turned to the room, and even from across the floor, Ethan could see the tension in the line of her shoulders, the controlled quality of a posture that was working to stay controlled. She hadn't seen him yet. Derek Paulson had. His expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise, calculation, something that settled into a particular kind of defensive neutrality. Cole? His voice carried across the room. You don't have clearance to be on this floor. Several people looked up. The room got a half-degree quieter. Ethan walked toward the primary operations console without looking at Paulson. Stop that diagnostic sequence, he said to the 3 engineers. Right now. One of them, a young woman named Sarah that Ethan had worked with twice on network upgrades and who he knew to be genuinely competent, looked up at him, then at Paulson, then back at Ethan. She'd already seen what the sequence was doing to the error rates. Ethan could see it in her face. She reached over and terminated the process. What the hell do you think you're... Paulson started. Every time you run that script, Ethan said, still not looking at him, pulling up the traffic map on the console, you are giving the attacker a 30-second window of elevated access to the routing table. They've used it 4 times already. You've handed them 4 windows. He finally looked at Paulson. What exactly have you been telling the CEO is happening here? Paulson's face did something complicated. This is a server anomaly. I have 17 years of... It's not a server anomaly. Ethan turned to the traffic map. It's a supply chain intrusion that has been active for approximately 72 hours. The threat actor gained access through a compromised software update in the secondary authentication layer. I contained it last night. Someone restarted the system this morning. The containment is gone. He said it to the room, to everyone, because at this point, there was no version of this situation that benefited from controlling the information. Right now, they are inside the payment processing core, and they are looking for the transaction authorization pathway. When they find it, and based on their movement speed, that's somewhere between 90 minutes and 3 hours from now, they will install a fractional redirect. You will not know it's there. You will lose money for 6 to 8 months before the audit trails make it visible, and by then it will be gone. The room was quiet except for the sound of the network equipment. That's a significant claim, Paulson said. His voice had recovered some of its authority, the particular authority of someone who had held a title for long enough to use it as a shield. Based on what evidence exactly? Based on 72 hours of watching them move through the system. Ethan looked at him. Based on the 3.5-page incident document I left on this console this morning before I was escorted out of the building. Based on the access logs that are right there, he pointed, if you want to look at them instead of running scripts that make everything worse. Mr. Cole. He hadn't heard her cross the room. Victoria Sterling was standing 5 feet away, phone at her side, and she was looking at him with an expression that was harder to read than anything else in the room. Not hostile, not embarrassed, not defensive in the way Paulson was defensive. Just sharp and focused, and taking him in the way you took in something you were trying to recalibrate against. You came back, she said. There are 40,000 businesses connected to this payment network. He said it evenly. Most of them are small. A restaurant, a medical practice, He stopped. They didn't make any decisions this morning. They're just connected to infrastructure that's currently compromised. Something moved through her face. Not performance. She wasn't performing for the room. She wasn't making a point of being affected. It was more like a small recalibration, a shift in whatever model she'd been working with. What do you need? She asked. Behind her, Paulson made a sound. Primary console access, Ethan said. Full administrative credentials. And I need everyone to stop running recovery protocols until I tell them otherwise. Victoria looked at him for another moment. Then she turned to Marcus. Give him what he needs. Ms. Sterling, Paulson started. Derek. Her voice didn't change, but something in it did. How many transactions failed in the last hour? A pause. Approximately more or fewer than the hour before? Paulson's jaw tightened. More. Then either your approach is working and I'm not seeing it, or something needs to change. She looked at him steadily. I'd rather change the approach than wait to find out which one it is. Paulson looked at Ethan with an expression that Ethan recognized. It was the expression of someone who understood that they had just been moved off the board but hadn't yet decided what to do with that understanding. And then he looked away. Marcus handed Ethan an administrator credential token. Ethan sat down at the console and started working. Botin. The first thing he did was map the damage. This took 40 minutes and required him to essentially reconstruct from the access logs everything the attacker had done since the system restart. Every probe, every test, every small adjustment they'd made as they navigated through the network architecture. It was painstaking, and it was deeply uncomfortable in the way that understanding exactly how badly something had gone wrong was always uncomfortable, but it was necessary because you couldn't build a defense against a position you hadn't mapped. Sarah worked beside him, which he hadn't asked for but was grateful for. She was good at translating what he was seeing into the monitoring systems the rest of the team could track, and she did it without asking him to explain himself constantly, which was the most useful thing anyone could do right now. The rest of the floor had settled into a kind of tense operational quiet. People were working, but they were working differently than they'd been working when he walked in. Less reactive, more careful, taking their direction from what Ethan was doing at the console rather than from the spinning wheels of automated recovery scripts. Whether Paulson had actually accepted the situation or simply retreated to a corner to manage his own reaction to it, Ethan couldn't tell and didn't particularly care. Victoria Sterling had not left the floor. This registered with Ethan peripherally. He was aware of her presence the way you were aware of certain things while you were focused on something else, the way you heard rain on windows while you were reading. She moved around the room, spoke quietly with people, spent 10 minutes on her phone in what appeared to be a difficult conversation, came back. She didn't hover over his shoulder. She didn't ask him to explain every step. She didn't perform involvement for the room. At some point around 5 o'clock, she appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee. Not from the operations floor machine, which produced something approximately the color and temperature of coffee, but from the cafe 2 floors up, still hot. She set it beside the keyboard without saying anything and moved away. Ethan looked at the cup for a moment. Then he picked it up and kept working. By 6:15, he had completed the damage map and built a revised containment structure, more robust than the one he'd constructed the previous night. incorporating what he'd learned from watching the attacker move over the past 12 hours. The new structure used the attacker's own movement patterns against them, routing their probe traffic into a series of decoy architecture segments that looked legitimate from inside the network, but connected to nothing that mattered. "That's elegant," Sarah said quietly, looking at the routing diagram on her monitor. "It's also temporary," Ethan said. "This doesn't remove them, it just puts a box around them again. To actually remove them, we're going to have to do a controlled system isolation, and that's—" He looked at the clock. "That's a bigger operation. We need to get through tonight first." He sat back and looked at the screen, and for the first time since he'd sat down, he let himself feel how tired he was. Not the managed tiredness of someone keeping it functional, but the actual depth of it, the weight of 2 days and the specific emotional residue of being fired and then having to come back to the place that fired him and prove, in front of everyone, that the dismissal had been a mistake. He wasn't angry about it. Or he was, but the anger was very far away right now, behind the tiredness, behind the concentration, behind the awareness of what was still unresolved. He was aware of Victoria Sterling standing about 10 feet away, not looking at him, watching the network map on the central display. Her expression had changed since the morning. Not dramatically, not in any way that looked like a performance of having changed. Just the small incremental shift of someone who had been moving fast and had hit something that required them to stop and look at where they were. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. "Lily, did you fix it yet?" He almost smiled. He typed back, "Working on it." "Lily, okay, Mrs. Huang made soup. I saved you some." "Lily, it's not very good soup, but I saved you some." He set the phone down. "Is that your kid?" He looked up. Victoria was closer than he'd realized. She'd moved while he was looking at his phone, and she was now standing at the edge of his workstation, not invading it exactly, but present in a way that was different from the professional distance she'd maintained for the past 4 hours. "Yeah," he said. She looked at his phone, not intrusively, just a glance. "How old?" 7. Something crossed her face. She looked at the monitors for a moment, then back at him. "She knows you're here?" "She knows." He paused. "She's with a neighbor. She's used to—" He stopped because he'd been about to say something like, "She's used to this," and he wasn't sure that was something he wanted to say out loud to this particular person right now. Victoria seemed to hear the stopped sentence anyway. She didn't push it. She looked at the network map on his monitor, the new containment structure holding cleanly, the attacker's traffic moving in predictable loops through the decoy architecture. "It's stable," she said. "For now." "For how long?" "Tonight. Maybe through tomorrow morning, if nothing disrupts it." He met her eyes. "But we need to do a full isolation and remediation. That's a 12-hour operation minimum, needs to be planned properly, needs a full team." He held her gaze. "Needs someone who knows the system architecture." She looked at him for a moment. He could see her processing it, not just the technical reality of it, but the other reality underneath it, the one that had been sitting in the room unspoken since he walked through the elevator doors. "I know what I did this morning," she said. She said it quietly, without preamble, without the kind of careful management that would have announced itself as an apology before it had decided whether to be one. Ethan didn't say anything. "I didn't ask you a single question," she continued. She wasn't looking at him now. She was looking at the monitors. "I saw what I expected to see, and I—" A small pause. "Made a decision without the information to make it." "Yes," Ethan said, because that was true, and he was too tired to dress it up. She looked at him then. There was something in her expression that was close to the thing you felt when you'd made a mistake of a particular type. Not embarrassment exactly, but the specific discomfort of recognizing something about your own judgment that you'd rather not have had confirmed. "I'd like you to lead the remediation," she said, "if you're willing." "I'll think about it," Ethan said, which was the most honest answer he had, because he wasn't going to say yes simply because she'd asked, and he wasn't going to say no out of principle, and somewhere in between those two things was an actual decision that he'd need to make when he wasn't running on 48 hours of interrupted sleep and adrenaline and whatever the cafe coffee had been doing to keep him functional. Victoria nodded once and moved away. Ethan turned back to the monitors. Outside the windows of the 14th floor, Chicago had moved fully into evening. The city lights sharp against a sky that had gone the particular dark blue that preceded full dark, the lake invisible in the distance, but there, he knew, the way certain things were there, even when you couldn't see them. The containment was holding. He picked up his phone and typed, "Save me some soup." He left the building at 9:40 that night, which was later than he'd intended and earlier than he probably should have, given that the remediation plan he'd sketched out in the last hour was still more outlined than blueprint. But the containment was stable. Sarah had a direct line to his cell, and he had a daughter at home who had saved him bad soup, and at some point those calculations had to be allowed to matter. The cab ride home was quiet. He sat in the back seat and watched the city go by and didn't think about anything in particular, which was its own kind of exhaustion. The state you reached when your brain had been running at full capacity for so long that it simply stopped generating new input and went passive, processing the world through the window like a screen misses. Huang was asleep on the couch when he came in, which she did sometimes, and he covered her with the blanket from the armchair and turned off the television and stood for a moment in the dark living room listening to the apartment breathe. Lily's bedroom door was half open, the nightlight casting its familiar orange triangle across the hallway floor. He looked in on her. She was asleep on her side, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, her book on the floor where it had fallen. He picked the book up and set it on the nightstand and pulled her arm back onto the bed, and she didn't wake up, just made a small sound and resettled. He stood there longer than he needed to. Then he went to the kitchen, found the soup. She was right, it wasn't very good. Something had gone wrong with the seasoning and the carrots were overcooked, and ate it standing at the counter because sitting down felt like a commitment he wasn't ready to make. He was still eating when his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. All quiet. Containment holding. Go to sleep. He put the phone face down on the counter and finished the soup. He slept for 6 hours, which was not enough but was what was available, and woke up at 6 in the morning with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system had decided that sleep was a resource that had been spent and now it was time to work. He made coffee. He checked the monitoring feeds. The containment was still holding. The attacker's traffic was still moving in the same predictable loops through the decoy architecture, finding nothing, going nowhere. He thought, they'll figure it out eventually. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. He thought, we need to move faster than they do. Bammed. He was back at Meridian by 7:30, which was before most of the operations floor had arrived, and he used the quiet to build the remediation plan properly. Not the outline from the night before, but the actual operational sequence step by step, with contingencies for the 3 most likely failure modes and timing estimates for each phase. It was the kind of work he did best when no one was asking him questions or requiring him to translate his thinking into language that other people could follow in real time. By 9 o'clock, he had a document that was 11 pages long and represented, as far as he could make it, a complete and executable plan for isolating and removing the threat actor from Meridian's network without triggering the payload he was now almost certain they had partially installed in the transaction authorization layer. That last part, the partially installed payload, was the thing that kept snagging his attention. He'd found traces of it in the access logs from the previous night, thin markers of code insertion that were subtle enough that automated scanning would miss them entirely. He'd looked for it specifically because he'd predicted it, and even so it had taken him 2 hours to find the edges of it. Whoever had written this intrusion had written it with real skill. This wasn't opportunistic hacking. This was a deliberate, targeted operation against Meridian specifically. The question of who and why was one he'd set aside during the emergency phase, because it was secondary to stopping the immediate damage. But it was starting to move back toward the foreground. Someone had invested significant resources into this attack. Someone knew Meridian systems well enough to design a payload specifically tailored to their payment processing architecture. That kind of knowledge didn't come from outside. He was thinking about that when Victoria Sterling arrived on the floor at 9:25 Sombon. She looked like she had slept, which surprised him slightly. Not because he'd expected her to look destroyed, but because he'd half expected the practiced appearance of someone who hadn't slept but was performing having slept, the particular executive grooming that covered tracks. She didn't look like that. She looked tired in a regular human way, the kind of tired that comes through makeup and clean clothes and good posture and just sits quietly in the eyes. She came directly to his workstation, which told him she'd been told he was here. "You came back," she said. It was the second time she'd said that to him, and the difference between this version and yesterday's version was significant enough that neither of them pretended otherwise. "I said I'd think about it," Ethan said. "I thought about it." She looked at the 11-page document on his monitor. "Is that the remediation plan?" "First draft." "Can I read it?" He pulled up a second screen and moved the document over. She sat down in the empty chair beside him, not asking, just doing it, which he noted, and started reading. She read carefully, which he also noted because people who read carefully at 9 in the morning with a security crisis still active were different from people who skimmed for bullet points. She read for 12 minutes without saying anything. He used the time to run the current access logs through a script he'd written overnight to flag any new payload activity. "This section," she said finally, pointing at the screen. Phase 2. "You're talking about taking the entire payment processing cluster offline for the..." She checked. 4 hours minimum." "Correct." "During which time no transactions process." "Correct." She sat back. "That's 40,000 businesses with no payment capability for 4 hours." "It's 40,000 businesses with no payment capability for 4 hours," Ethan said, "or it's 40,000 businesses with no payment capability for 6 to 8 months while we figure out how much money went missing and try to recover it from an offshore account." He looked at her. "The 4 hours is recoverable. The other option isn't." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her doing the calculations, not just the technical ones, but the other ones, the ones that involved board members and press releases, and the particular exposure of being 7 days into a new executive role when something catastrophic either happened or was narrowly prevented. "When?" she asked. "Tonight, 2 in the morning. Transaction volume is lowest between 2 and 4, and we need to start from the lowest possible baseline." He paused. "I need a full team on site, 12 people minimum, and I need Paulson kept away from the primary console." Something moved through her expression at that last part. "I know he's your CISO, Ethan said. "I'm not trying to..." "No." She shook her head. "You're right. I'll handle Derek." She said it without apparent difficulty, which told him something about how the last 24 hours had adjusted her read of the situation. "Who else do you need?" He gave her a list of 7 names, all engineers he'd worked with and trusted to execute under pressure. She wrote them down without editorial comment. Sarah's name was on the list, and Victoria nodded when she saw it, which told Ethan that she'd already figured out who had stayed with him through yesterday. "There's one more thing," Ethan said. He'd been deciding whether to say this for the past hour and had arrived at the conclusion that not saying it was more dangerous than saying it. The payload these people designed, it's not generic. It was built for Meridian's architecture specifically. Specific version numbers, specific code pathways that aren't in any public documentation. She looked at him. "Someone gave them the blueprint," he said, "or sold it, or they have someone inside." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not accusing anyone specifically. I don't have enough to do that. But when this is over, that question needs to be answered, because if there's an inside source and we don't find them, we're going to be doing this again in 6 months. The expression on her face was harder to read than any of the others he'd seen from her in the past day. Not surprised. She'd been running this organization for 8 days, even if the first 7 hadn't included a cyber attack, and surprise wasn't something she was going to let herself perform. Something more considered than that. Something that looked like someone incorporating a genuinely unpleasant possibility into an already complicated picture. "I'll bring in external forensics," she said, "after tonight." Agreed. She stood up, and for a moment she was just standing there beside his workstation, and the floor was starting to fill up around them, and the day was beginning its complicated motion. She looked at the network map on his monitor, the attacker still cycling through the decoy loops, still finding nothing. And he could see her processing the scale of it, the sheer sustained effort of what he'd built over the past 48 hours, the infrastructure of it. "Cole," she said. He looked up. "The notes you left yesterday morning." She said it without preamble. "I read them last night, the full document." A small pause. The warning about restarting the system was on the first page. Ethan didn't say anything. "I know that doesn't help anything," she said. "I'm just..." She stopped. I wanted you to know that I read it. Okay, he said. She nodded and walked toward her office. The day moved fast and also didn't move at all. The way days moved when you were waiting for a specific fixed point in time that was still many hours away. Ethan worked. His team assembled gradually through the morning, people he'd called the night before, some of whom had heard about the firing and were visibly uncertain about the geometry of his reappearance, all of whom set that aside within an hour of sitting down with him and looking at the scope of what they were dealing with. Sarah ran point on the monitoring side. A systems engineer named Todd Bricker, who had the demeanor of a man who treated disasters as puzzles and had never to Ethan's knowledge expressed stress in any visible form, handled the network isolation sequences. 2 junior engineers, one of whom was so nervous in the first hour that he made 3 consecutive data entry errors and then apologized to Ethan in a way that suggested he was expecting to be yelled at, which told Ethan something about the floor's normal atmosphere, settled down once they realized what they were doing and why it mattered. Paulson made one appearance in the late morning, during which he stood at the edge of the cluster of workstations for approximately 4 minutes, said nothing, and left. No one made a point of it. The room simply continued working. At 12:30, Ethan's phone rang. He looked at the screen, a number he didn't recognize, area code 312, Chicago local. He answered. Cole. A pause, then a voice he didn't know. Male, careful, the particular carefulness of someone reading from a prepared position. Mr. Cole, my name is Richard Vance. I'm calling on behalf of a group of stakeholders who have a significant interest in Meridian's current situation. Ethan kept his expression neutral. What group is that? I'm not in a position to be specific at this stage. I will say that our interests and yours may be more aligned than you'd expect. Another pause, the kind that was designed to feel meaningful. We're aware of the work you've been doing over the past 48 hours. We're aware of what you found in the transaction authorization layer. We'd like to talk. Talk about what? About the remediation you're planning for tonight, specifically about whether proceeding with it serves your best interests. The voice was still careful, still reading from something, but underneath it there was a slight edge that the carefulness was working to cover. You've been treated poorly by this company, Mr. Cole. Fired publicly, humiliated. And here you are, coming back to save them anyway. We think that deserves... Who installed the payload? Ethan asked. A pause, longer than the others. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Ethan stood up slowly and moved away from the cluster of workstations toward the window, lowering his voice. Whoever you're representing knew this attack was happening, maybe helped plan it. And now you're calling me, which means you're either nervous about what I'm going to find when we do the remediation tonight, or you want to delay it, or both. He looked out at the Chicago skyline, gray and cold under an overcast sky. What exactly are you offering? Another pause. The careful voice had shifted slightly. A significant financial consideration in exchange for... Stop. He said it quietly. I'm going to hang up now, and then I'm going to tell our CEO about this call, and then I'm going to continue doing exactly what I was going to do tonight. He paused. And if I were the person who arranged this attack, I'd be more worried about the forensics team that's going to go through the access logs after we finish tonight than I would be about me, because I'm just trying to fix the infrastructure. The forensics team is going to be trying to find you. He ended the call. He stood at the window for a moment, looking at the city. His heart was moving faster than it should have been, which was annoying. He wasn't scared, but his body was apparently less certain about that than his brain. He made himself breathe at a normal rate. He watched a plane on a low approach to O'Hare, its landing lights blinking against the gray afternoon. Then he turned around and walked to Victoria Sterling's office. Her assistant, a young man named Philip, who had the slightly glazed quality of someone who had been fielding phone calls since dawn, looked up when Ethan appeared. Is she available? Ethan asked. She's on a call with the board. Tell her I need 3 minutes. He paused. Tell her it's relevant to tonight. Philip knocked on the glass door, leaned in, said something. A moment later, Victoria appeared in the doorway, phone still in hand, and looked at Ethan with an expression that had already decided this was important. Give me 1 minute, she said into the phone. She stepped into the small space outside her office door and looked at Ethan. What happened? He told her about the call. Concisely and completely, the way he'd learned to report information to people who needed to act on it. No editorializing, no interpretation, just the facts in order. Her expression didn't change while he talked, which he'd come to understand was not blankness, but attention, the particular stillness of someone processing quickly. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You think it's an inside source? I think it's more than an inside source. I think someone with board-level or near-board-level access was involved in planning this. He said it carefully. I don't know who. I'm not in a position to know who, but the call came 6 hours before the remediation, which means they know our timeline, and that kind of information doesn't circulate widely. She looked at him steadily. You told me to come to you if anything felt wrong. You didn't know to tell me that yet, he said. That's why I'm telling you now. Something in her face moved briefly. She looked at her phone, then back at him. I need to make a different call, one that doesn't go through the company's standard channels. A small pause. Do you know anyone in federal financial crimes? I know one person, Ethan said. She's with the FBI's cyber division. I worked with her on an industry task force 2 years ago. She's good. Can you call her tonight, before we start the remediation? I can call her in the next hour. Victoria nodded. Then she said, Are we still going tonight? Yes. He didn't hesitate on that. Delaying is worse. Whoever made that call, they want us to delay. That alone is a reason not to. She held his gaze for a moment. Okay. She turned back toward her office, then stopped. She turned around. Cole. He looked at her. When this is over, she said, I want to talk about what comes next. Your role here. A pause that contained more than its length suggested. I want to do that right. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Let's get through tonight first, he said. She nodded and went back to her call. Mom. The afternoon folded into evening the way November afternoons in Chicago folded into evening. Quickly, without ceremony, the light going from gray to darker gray to the particular amber of streetlights starting to matter. By 7 o'clock, the remediation team was fully assembled, and Ethan had walked them through the plan twice, the second time slower, stopping for questions, watching for the places where the explanation didn't land. Todd Bricker asked 3 questions, all of them exactly right. Sarah had 2 concerns about the timing of Phase 2 that Ethan agreed with and incorporated. One of the junior engineers, the nervous one, whose name was Kevin, and who had settled down significantly over the course of the day, pointed out a sequencing issue in Phase 3 that Ethan had overlooked, and that, if they'd hit it at 2 in the morning, would have cost them 40 minutes at minimum. Good catch, Ethan told him, and Kevin blinked like someone who'd been bracing for a different response. At 8:30, Ethan called the FBI contact, a woman named Agent Dana Reese, who answered on the second ring and listened to a 4-minute summary with the specific quality of silence that characterized people who heard a lot of things and had learned to extract what mattered quickly. She said she'd have people monitoring the financial channels overnight and that she needed the access log files, which Ethan sent her from his laptop in the stairwell while eating half a sandwich that Sarah had produced from somewhere. He called Lily at 9. She was already in bed, or supposed to be, but she answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. Are you still fixing it? She asked. Still fixing it. He was sitting on the stairs between the 14th and 15th floors, back against the wall, feet on the step below. We start the main work at 2 in the morning. That's really late. Yeah. Will it work? He thought about the 11-page plan. He thought about Kevin's catch this afternoon, the sequencing issue that would have cost them 40 minutes, and he thought about how plans had failure points you found in advance, and failure points you found when you were already in the middle and there was nothing to do but adapt. I think so, he said. I think we've got the right people. A pause. Dad? Yeah. The lady who fired you. Lily's voice was careful in the particular way it got when she was asking something she'd been thinking about for a while. Is she sorry? Ethan looked at the concrete stairs, at the industrial lighting of the stairwell, at the sandwich in his hand. He thought about Victoria Sterling standing at his workstation this morning saying, I wanted you to know that I read it. He thought about the coffee that had appeared beside his keyboard yesterday evening without comment or ceremony. "I think she's trying to be," he said. Lily considered this. "That's different than actually being sorry." "Yeah," Ethan said, "but it's a start." Another pause. "Okay." She sounded like she was settling something. "I'm going to sleep now." "Good. Fix it, Dad." "Working on it." He finished the sandwich after he hung up. The stairwell was cold and badly lit and quiet, except for the distant sound of the city outside and the closer sound of the building's ventilation system moving air through the walls. He sat there for another few minutes, not thinking about anything specific, just existing in the quiet. Then he stood up and went back to work. By 11:30, the team had completed every preparatory step they could complete before the operational window. The access logs from the day showed the attacker still cycling through the decoy architecture. Patient, systematic, covering the same ground repeatedly with the slight variations of someone who suspected they were in a loop but hadn't confirmed it yet. The partially installed payload sat in the transaction authorization layer, like a splinter you couldn't see but could feel, and Ethan had mapped its exact location 4 hours ago and knew precisely how to remove it without triggering the validation routine that would activate it prematurely. Victoria Sterling had stayed on the floor all evening. She'd taken calls, worked from a laptop at a spare workstation, brought in food for the team at some point that no one asked her to bring, and that got eaten without much acknowledgement because everyone was focused. She hadn't inserted herself into the technical work. She'd been present in the way a person was present, who understood that their presence was a choice that communicated something and had made that choice deliberately. At midnight, Ethan called a 2-hour break and told everyone to sleep on the couches in the break room if they could. Half of them did. He didn't. He sat at his workstation in the quiet of the half-dark floor and watched the monitoring feeds and thought about the phone call from Richard Vance and about what Vance had said about significant financial consideration and about the fact that someone inside this building had known enough about Meridian's architecture to design a targeted payload against it. And he turned the question over in his mind the way you turned a stone over to see what lived underneath. At 1:45, he woke the team. At 2 o'clock exactly, Ethan Cole typed the first command of the remediation sequence. The system went dark. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. That was how long it took for the emergency lighting to kick in across the 14th floor. 4 seconds of complete blackness, where the only light came from the monitoring stations running on independent power, their screens casting cold blue rectangles across the faces of 12 people who had stopped breathing in slightly different ways. Then the emergency lights came on, that flat institutional yellow, and everyone started breathing again. "Phase 1 complete," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. She'd been steady all night, the particular steadiness of someone who dealt with fear by converting it directly into focus. "Payment cluster is isolated. External traffic zeroed." Ethan was already moving through the next sequence. His hands were doing the work his brain had rehearsed approximately 40 times in the past 18 hours, which was the only reliable way to operate at 2 in the morning on insufficient sleep in the middle of something that had real consequences if it went wrong. You rehearsed until the sequence lived in your fingers, and then you trusted your fingers and kept your brain available for the things that couldn't be rehearsed. The unexpected variations, the failure points that no plan survived contact with intact. "Bricker," he said without looking up. "Isolation sequence running," Todd said from the station 2 positions down. He was eating a granola bar with one hand and running commands with the other, which was either admirable or disturbing depending on how you looked at it. Decoy architecture standing down in 30 seconds. This was the delicate part. When the decoy loops went dark, the attacker would know something had changed. The question was whether they'd try to force an exit through the payload, which would trigger the validation routine, which would activate the fractional redirect prematurely and cause a mess that was recoverable but ugly, or whether they'd go dormant and wait, which was what a sophisticated operator would do. Ethan had assessed them as sophisticated. He was counting on that assessment being right. "Decoy down," Todd said. Everyone waited. On the monitoring screen, the attacker's traffic signature, the characteristic pattern Ethan had been watching for 3 days now, as familiar to him by this point as a voice, went quiet. Not absent. quiet, watching. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't fully been holding. Okay, they're dormant. He looked at Sarah. Phase 2. Sort. Phase 2 was the extraction of the partial payload from the transaction authorization layer, which was the step that had kept Ethan awake for the 2 hours he'd spent not sleeping on the break room couch. The payload wasn't fully installed. That was the only piece of luck in any of this. But partial installation created its own set of problems because the code was sitting in the layer in a half-active state, like a fuse that had been partially lit, and removing it required care that the time pressure made difficult. He'd written a custom extraction script that afternoon. He'd tested it 3 times on a sandboxed replica of the production environment. It had worked all 3 times, which was not the same thing as certainty, but was the closest thing to certainty that this situation was going to offer. Kevin was running the sandbox monitor alongside him, watching for any flag that the validation routine had detected the extraction attempt. Kevin had barely spoken for the past 2 hours except to confirm commands, and he had the expression of someone who understood exactly how much was riding on the next 30 minutes, and had decided that the way to handle that was to not look away from his screen for any reason. Ethan ran the extraction script. For 11 seconds, nothing happened, and those 11 seconds had the specific quality of held time that you only experienced when consequences were large and immediate, and you were suspended in the gap between the action and the result. Then Kevin said, "Clean! Validation routine did not trigger. Payload is..." He checked twice. "Payload is out." Sarah made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Todd Bricker said, "Nice," in the tone of someone complimenting a well-executed parallel park. Ethan sat back for exactly 3 seconds. Then he moved to Phase 3. Phase 3 was the hunt. This was the part of the remediation plan that he hadn't fully explained to the team in the walkthrough. Not because he was withholding anything, but because it was the part that depended most on real-time judgment, and he hadn't wanted to overscript it. With the payload extracted and the attacker dormant inside the isolated cluster, they had a window, narrow and uncertain in duration, to trace the attacker's access path back through the network architecture to the point of original entry. Find the entry point, close it, and the attacker had no way back in. Miss it, and they'd be back in a month, having learned from everything that had happened. He'd been thinking about the point of origin since the phone call from Richard Vance. The conventional logic was that supply chain intrusions entered through compromised software updates, a vendor's package that had been tampered with somewhere in the delivery chain, a legitimate credential that had been stolen and misused. Ethan had initially worked on that assumption, but the payload's architecture kept pulling at him, kept suggesting something different. The specificity of it, the precise version numbers, the knowledge of internal pathways that weren't documented publicly. That wasn't the profile of an outside actor who'd studied the system from the outside. That was someone who'd had access to the inside. He traced the original intrusion vector through the logs, going back further than he'd gone before, past the 72-hour window he'd been working in, back 5 weeks, 6 weeks, looking for the first anomalous handshake, the first irregular signature. He found it at 7 weeks, a routine software update to the secondary authentication layer, legitimate vendor, legitimate credentials, legitimate package signature. Everything clean on the surface. But inside the package, nested 3 layers deep in a dependency file that automated scanning wouldn't touch, a small, persistent access module that had been sitting dormant in Meridian's network for 7 weeks, waiting. "Sarah," Ethan said, "I need you to pull the vendor authorization records for this package." He sent her the timestamp. Who approved the update? Who had access to the approval queue that week? Sarah pulled the records. She looked at them. She went quiet for a moment. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her monitor. The update had been approved by Derek Paulson. The room didn't react because the room didn't know what it meant yet. Only Ethan and Sarah could see her screen, and Ethan had been prepared for a result that pointed inward, had been prepared for it for the past several hours. But preparation and reality were different things, and for a moment he simply sat with it, feeling the weight of it settle. "Don't say anything yet," he said quietly to Sarah. She nodded. He kept working. Approving an update wasn't evidence of anything by itself. That was Paulson's job. He approved updates routinely, and a sophisticated operation would have designed it to look exactly like routine. What Ethan needed was the other piece, the thing that connected Paulson to the people who'd built the payload, and that piece was either in the logs or it wasn't, and he was going to look before he said a word to anyone. He looked. He found it 40 minutes later, buried in the network communication records from 3 months ago. A series of encrypted external connections from a workstation registered to Paulson's credentials, originating outside normal business hours, routing through a VPN service to an address that Agent Dana Reese would be better positioned than Ethan to identify, but that did not, in any configuration he could imagine, look like legitimate business traffic. He copied everything, all of it. Time-stamped, authenticated, preserved in a format that would survive legal scrutiny. Then he called Dana Reese. She answered on the second ring. It was 3:45 in the morning, and she sounded completely awake, which either meant she'd been up or she was the kind of person who went from asleep to operational without a noticeable gap. "Tell me you have something," she said. "I have something," Ethan said. He was in the stairwell again, back against the wall, voice low. He told her what he'd found. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a short silence. "Send me the files," she said. "All of it, exactly as you found it, nothing modified." "Already sent." "Good." A pause. "Cole, don't confront him. Don't tell him what you found. If he's the inside source, he has people outside this building who are watching this operation, and if he knows you found the connection, he will either run or he will try to destroy the evidence and possibly make this situation more complicated than it already is." "Understood. We'll handle it from our side. You focus on finishing the remediation." He went back upstairs. Said, Victoria Sterling was awake. He'd assumed she'd shown no indication over the past 2 days of being someone who absented herself when things were happening. But there was something that still caught him slightly off guard about seeing her sitting at the spare workstation at 4 in the morning, jacket off, sleeves rolled once, drinking something from a paper cup that had almost certainly gone cold. She looked up when he came back from the stairwell, and her eyes asked the question her mouth didn't. "We're on track," he said. He sat down at his workstation. "Phase 3 is done. We're moving to 4. She watched him for a moment. There was something in her face, not quite the executive calculation he'd seen from her in the first day, not quite what had replaced it in the days since. Something more direct than either. "You found it," she said. "The entry point." "Yes." "And?" He looked at her. He thought about Dana Reese's instruction, "Don't confront him." And he thought about the specific question Victoria was asking, which wasn't about the technical entry point, but about what he'd found attached to it. "There are people who need to see what I found before we talk about it openly," he said carefully. "Federal people. I've already been in contact with them tonight." He watched her process that. He watched the calculation move through her face, the pieces assembling, the implication arriving. To her credit, she didn't perform shock. She sat very still for a moment, and then she said, "Is it someone in this building?" "I can't say yet." She held his gaze for several seconds. Then she nodded once, and he could see her making the same decision he'd made, to put the thing she now half knew into a box and keep it there until the box could be opened safely, because the alternative was to let it out prematurely and compromise something larger. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you need for Phase 4. Phase 4 was the restoration, bringing the systems back online in sequence, validating each layer before enabling the next, confirming transaction processing was clean, and the attacker's access had been fully severed. It was the most time-consuming part, and in some ways the most nerve-wracking because it required them to watch the system come back to life and trust that what they'd done in the previous 2 hours had actually worked. Ethan had seen restorations go sideways before. You thought you'd cleaned everything, and then something surfaced that you'd missed, some residual piece of code or a corrupted routing table, and you had to stop and go back in, and the window stretched and the timeline collapsed. He'd built contingencies for the 3 most likely scenarios, but contingencies were just organized panic, and there was no version of a network restoration that didn't have a component of raw uncertainty in it. They started at 4:15. The first layer, infrastructure, came back clean. Sarah ran 3 separate validation checks, and all 3 came back green. The second layer, authentication, came back with a single anomaly flag that turned out to be a false positive from the custom extraction script, which had left a benign residue that looked suspicious to the validator. Kevin caught it, identified it correctly in about 90 seconds, and cleared it. His hands had stopped shaking somewhere around 3 in the morning, and he was now running his station with the focused calm of someone who had decided that the situation required him to be competent and had simply become competent. The third layer, payment processing, was the one they'd all been moving toward. Ethan ran the restoration sequence manually, not trusting it to automation, reading each response code as it came back and comparing it against the expected values. The room was quiet in a way it hadn't been all night. Not the tense quiet of waiting for something to go wrong, but the different quiet of people concentrating on something that mattered. The processing core came back online at 5:03 in the morning. For 30 seconds, nobody said anything. They watched the transaction validators run their startup checks, watched the routing tables populate, watched the first test transactions move through the system, flagged, controlled, running through a closed validation loop that Ethan had set up specifically for this moment. Clean, clean, clean. "We're up," Sarah said, and her voice came out slightly different than her usual voice. Slightly less managed, the way voices sounded when people had been holding things together for a long time, and something had finally given them permission to stop. Todd Bricker finished somehow his second granola bar of the night and said, "There it is," without particular drama, which Ethan found deeply, specifically satisfying. Kevin put both hands over his face for a moment and then put them back on his keyboard and started running the post-restoration validation suite. Ethan sat looking at the screens. The payment processing network was alive. The transaction flow looked clean. The attacker's signature was absent from every layer, not dormant, not cycling through decoys, simply gone, cut off at the entry point he'd sealed 4 hours ago. He was aware of something that was not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, more like the specific feeling of a sustained tension finally finding its resolution. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just the quiet physical fact of something that had been wound tight for 3 days beginning to release. His phone showed 5:17 in the morning. Outside the windows of the 14th floor, Chicago was still fully dark, but the darkness had the slightly different quality of pre-dawn, the city beginning its long, slow gathering toward morning without anyone who wasn't specifically paying attention to it yet. He became aware of Victoria Sterling standing a few feet away. She had her arms crossed, and she was looking at the restored processing core on the main display. And she had the expression of someone who had been carrying something and had just been allowed to set it down. "It worked," she said. "Mostly," Ethan said, because he was constitutionally unable to call anything complete before the full post-restoration audit, and because there were still things hanging unresolved that no amount of successful network remediation had addressed. The inside source. The federal investigation that was now in motion. The question of what came next in a building where the chief information security officer was about to become the subject of a federal inquiry. "Mostly is a lot better than where we were 3 days ago," Victoria said. He couldn't argue with that. She turned toward him, and for a moment the floor was quiet around them. The team running validations, the monitors humming, the city outside the windows beginning its slow return to visibility. She looked at him with an expression that had nothing professional in it, and nothing performed and nothing managed, just the direct look of someone who had arrived somewhere unexpected and was deciding what it meant. "Cole," she said, "go home." He looked at her. "We can run the validation audit from here. Sarah can lead it." She held his gaze. "You have a 7-year-old who saved you soup. Go home." He looked at the screens. He looked at his team, who were working efficiently and didn't need him standing over them. He looked at Victoria Sterling, who had been in this building for 22 consecutive hours and was telling him to leave. "The audit needs to be completed before—" "I know. Sarah will call you if anything flags." A small pause. "I will personally call you if anything flags." Ethan looked at the processing core. Clean, running, the transaction flow moving through its channels the way water moved through pipes inside walls. Invisible, reliable, doing the thing it was supposed to do. "Okay," he said. He picked up his jacket. He looked at his team. Kevin running validations, Todd already half asleep in his chair but still technically monitoring, Sarah moving with the efficient focus of someone who was good at things and knew it. "Sarah," he said. She looked up. "Call me if anything changes. Anything." I know. She gave him the look of someone who had been doing their job well for a long time and was comfortable with the territory. Go see your kid. He went to the elevator. He pressed the button and waited. And while he waited, he stood in the quiet of the hallway and felt the full weight of 3 days land on him at once. The tiredness of it, the accumulated cost of it, the specific particular feeling of having fought something hard and come out the other side intact. The elevator doors opened. Victoria Sterling's voice came from down the hall. Cole? He turned. She was standing outside her office, and she had the same expression she'd had before. Direct, unmanaged, something in it that he didn't have a clean word for. Thank you, she said. Not for the company, for... She stopped, seemed to be searching for the right shape of it. For coming back. He looked at her for a moment. You would have figured it out eventually, he said, because that was probably true, and because something in him was not ready to accept a cleaner ending than that. The corner of her mouth moved. Maybe, she said, but not in time. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. The lobby was empty at 5:30 in the morning. He walked through the glass doors and into air that was cold and damp and smelled like the lake and exhaust and something that might have been the beginning of rain. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not because he needed to, but because the city was doing something particular in the pre-dawn, something quiet and unpretentious, and he wanted to be in it for a second before he got in a cab. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, but when he looked at it, the area code was familiar. Dana Reese. We moved tonight. Your package was everything we needed. More coming. Good work, Cole. He stared at that for a moment. Then he flagged a cab. The ride home took 12 minutes, and he was almost asleep in the back seat when his phone buzzed again. Lily, somehow awake at 5:40 in the morning, as if she'd been listening for something. Did you fix it? He looked at the text. He thought about the processing core running clean, about the attacker's signature gone from every layer, about the 12 hours of work and the people who'd done it and the things that were still moving through their consequences. Yeah, he typed back. I think we fixed it. A pause. Then, good. Now come home. He was still looking at those 3 words when the cab pulled up to his building. The same building it always was, the same lobby light burning yellow through the glass door, the same elevator with the slightly sticky button for the 4th floor that he'd been meaning to report for 8 months. He went inside. He slept for 9 hours, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep he'd had in 2 weeks. And when he woke up, the apartment was full of the particular late morning light that came through the kitchen window in November at an angle that made everything look slower than it was. He lay in bed for a few minutes just listening to the building. The pipes, the distant sound of someone's television 2 floors up, the specific silence of a place where a child was not currently present, which meant Lily was at school and the world was continuing its ordinary motion without waiting for him to catch up. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and drank it and looked at the street below where a man was walking a dog that appeared to have strong opinions about a particular stretch of sidewalk near the corner. He watched them negotiate it. The dog won. His phone had 17 notifications that he'd slept through. He went through them in order of what required immediate attention and what required eventual attention and what required no attention at all. Sarah had sent 3 messages between 6 and 9 in the morning. The post-restoration audit was complete, all layers clean, full transaction processing restored, no anomalies. The 4th message, sent at 9:42, said simply, all good here, sleep. Dana Reese had sent 1 message at 7:15, formal interview request coming through official channels this week. Keep your calendar open. Also, you were right about the entry point. The VPN address traces somewhere interesting. More soon. Marcus had sent 2 messages that Ethan read and set aside for later, because what Marcus was navigating right now was its own complicated situation, and it wasn't something Ethan could help with before his second cup of coffee. There was 1 message from a number he now recognized as Victoria Sterling's direct line, sent at 8:03 in the morning. Audit complete. Systems stable. Board meeting called for Thursday. I'd like you there. VS. He put the phone down and finished his coffee. Then he picked the phone up and typed back, I'll be there. Shit. The next 3 days moved the way days moved after a crisis, in a slightly unreal register, the way the world looked after you'd been sick and gotten better, familiar but not quite resettled, everything slightly sharper than usual in that temporary way that didn't last. Ethan went to the office. He worked. He answered questions from the external forensics team that had arrived Tuesday morning, 4 people from a firm in Washington who moved through the building with the quiet thoroughness of people who had seen a lot of things and were not impressed by any of them. He answered questions from Dana Reese's team, which involved 2 sessions in a conference room on the 12th floor that were recorded and that required him to be precise in a way that he was comfortable with, but that was also exhausting in its specific demands. He also, because there was an office to run and a payment network to maintain and 40,000 businesses whose transactions needed to process, did his actual job. Or what he was beginning to think of as his actual job, though no one had formally defined what that was yet. On Wednesday afternoon, Derek Paulson did not come to work. His assistant sent an email saying he was ill, and everyone on the floor received this information and held it in the particular careful way you held information when you suspected it was not the whole truth, but were not in a position to say so. By Thursday morning, people had stopped expecting him to come back, the way people stopped expecting certain things when the air around them changed. Ethan didn't have confirmation of the details yet. Dana Reese had been precise about what she could and couldn't share while the investigation was active, but he knew enough to understand the shape of what had happened. Derek Paulson had been approached, probably at a point of personal vulnerability that Ethan didn't know and wasn't trying to imagine, by people with financial interests in destabilizing Meridian's payment network. Whether those interests were competitive or something more complicated, the forensics would eventually establish. What Paulson had done, and what had been done with what Paulson provided, was already clear enough in the logs. The hardest part about it, for Ethan, wasn't the betrayal. Betrayal was something you could put in a box labeled things people do and leave there. The hardest part was the waste of it. Paulson had been, in the areas where he'd actually known what he was doing, a reasonable CISO. He'd built a team. He'd implemented protocols. He'd approved budget requests for infrastructure improvements that Ethan had authored and that had been genuinely useful. Whatever had led him to the decision he'd eventually made, it had cost more than he'd probably calculated. But Ethan wasn't the one who'd have to sit across a table from Dana Reese and explain his reasoning, and that meant it wasn't his weight to carry. He carried enough. So the Thursday board meeting was held in a conference room on the 16th floor that Ethan had never been in before. Large, with a long table that could seat 20 and windows looking east toward the lake, which was visible today as a gray-blue line at the horizon. There were 14 people in the room when Ethan arrived, which was more than he'd expected. Board members, mostly, older men and 2 women in the particular clothes of people who spent a lot of time in rooms like this, plus the company's general counsel, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had the composed alertness of someone accustomed to being the most legally careful person in any given conversation, and Marcus, who was sitting near the end of the table and looked like he hadn't slept in the 3 days since the remediation in a way that suggested the nights had been occupied with things other than rest. Victoria Sterling was at the head of the table. She looked different in this room than she had on the 14th floor over the past 3 days. The same person, but in a different register, the formal composure back in place, the executive presentation that she'd arrived with on her first morning, except that Ethan had now seen enough of what was underneath it to understand that the composure wasn't the armor he'd initially read it as. It was more like a mode, something she used in certain contexts, the way a person used a particular voice when they needed to be understood clearly over distance. She looked at him when he came in and gave a small nod that contained nothing performative in it. He found a chair along the wall, not at the table, because no one had indicated he should sit at the table, and he was here to report and answer questions, not to participate in whatever governance process this meeting also involved. The meeting ran for 2.5 hours. The first hour was technical. Ethan walked the board through the incident timeline, the nature of the attack, the remediation, and the current status of the network. He answered questions. Some of them were good questions, asked by people who either had technical backgrounds or had done real preparation before the meeting. Some were questions that were really statements wearing question-shaped clothing, designed to establish a speaker's position rather than acquire information. Ethan answered those the same way he answered the real ones, directly, concisely, without editorializing. He had learned a long time ago that the best way to handle a room full of authority was to give it exactly what was true and let the truth do whatever it was going to do. The second hour was harder. It involved the inside source investigation. Patricia Osei led most of this section, with input from Dana Reese's team via a conference line, and it required a degree of careful language that Ethan found both necessary and faintly exhausting. The name Derek Paulson sat in the middle of the room without anyone saying it directly for about 40 minutes, and then Patricia Osei said it clearly and specifically, and the room absorbed it with the particular collective stillness of people encountering something they had suspected and had hoped not to confirm. One of the board members, a man in his 60s named Walter Creighton, who Ethan had been told was one of Harrison Sterling's oldest associates on the board, and who had, according to Marcus, been the most vocal in questioning Victoria's appointment, asked a question during this section that was not really about the security incident. "Ms. Sterling," Creighton said, in the tone of someone who had been waiting for a specific opening, "this incident occurred on your first day. A major security vulnerability, an inside actor who was a direct report of yours, a network failure that cost the company." He looked at his notes. Approximately $47 million in delayed transactions and associated remediation costs. He paused. "How do you characterize your responsibility for this outcome?" The room was quiet. Ethan watched Victoria. She looked at Creighton steadily for a moment, not defensively, not with the particular bracing quality of someone absorbing a hit they'd been expecting. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Ethan in the stairwell when she'd said, "I didn't ask you a single question," like someone who had already decided to be honest about the thing that was being asked about. "I made a significant error on my first morning," she said. "I terminated the employment of the person who had been managing the active security incident without asking him a single question about why he was there or what he'd been doing." She said it to the room, not to Creighton specifically. "I acted on an impression rather than information. That decision accelerated the crisis. It didn't cause the underlying attack, but it removed the only person in the building who fully understood what was happening and how to stop it." A pause. "That's my responsibility. I own it." Creighton looked at her. "And you consider that acceptable for someone in this role?" "No," she said. "I don't. I also don't consider it disqualifying." She held his gaze. "I made a mistake. I recognized it. Not quickly enough, but I recognized it. And then I made a different decision. One that I'd make again." She paused. "The question of whether I'm the right person for this role is a fair question to ask. I'd just rather you assessed it against everything that happened over the past week, not just the first 8 minutes." Creighton looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his notes. The third part of the meeting was the part that Ethan had not been expecting, and it began when Victoria said, "I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about structural changes that I'm recommending as a direct result of this incident." She had a document, printed, not on a screen, which Ethan noted as a deliberate choice in a room full of people who were more comfortable with paper than with the kind of technology they were in charge of overseeing. She'd had Philip distribute copies before the meeting started. Ethan didn't have a copy. He read the room's copies from a distance, catching phrases: escalation protocols, cross-department validation, anonymous reporting channel, mandatory response timelines for flagged security alerts. "These recommendations came directly from what happened last week," Victoria said. "Specifically, from the pattern of how warnings were raised, documented, and ignored by multiple layers of management before this incident became critical." She looked at the table. Ethan Cole sent documented warnings to 3 separate members of senior management over a 48-hour period. None of those warnings resulted in any action. That failure is a structural problem, not a personnel problem, and it requires a structural solution. She walked through each recommendation. She did it without drama and without the kind of corporate language that turns genuine concerns into performance of concern. She'd written it, Ethan could tell, herself. There was a directness in the phrasing, a lack of committee speak, that suggested one person's thinking rather than language that had been softened by multiple rounds of revision. When she finished, Walter Creighton said, "These changes would represent a significant shift in how the operations division relates to executive leadership." "Yes," Victoria said. They would. Some of us would argue that the current structure, she said, allowed a critical security warning to be dismissed by a CISO who, we now know, had a direct interest in ensuring that warning went unheard. She said it evenly. I'd argue that's a fairly significant indictment of the current structure. Creighton was quiet. The vote on the recommendations was not unanimous. 3 board members voted against, Creighton among them. The rest voted in favor, including 2 members who had originally been skeptical of Victoria's appointment and whose votes carried a weight that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The meeting ended at 12:40. People gathered their things and began the various small conversations that followed formal proceedings. The real conversations, the ones where people said what they'd been thinking during the official part. Ethan stood and moved toward the door because he had work to get back to, and because boardroom social dynamics were not a landscape he was particularly equipped to navigate. Cole! He turned. Victoria was still at the head of the table. The room had mostly cleared. Creighton was speaking with Patricia Osai near the window. Marcus was on his phone near the door. She walked toward him. She had the document in her hand and she held it out. Page 4, she said. Third recommendation. He took it and turned to page 4. The third recommendation on the page read, creation of a chief infrastructure security architect position, reporting directly to the CEO, with full operational authority over network security and infrastructure resilience. He read it once, then he read it again. That's a new position, he said. Yes. It didn't exist before. Correct. He looked at her. You wrote this. I wrote the whole document. She wasn't performing modesty or false casualness about it. But that one I wrote knowing who I was writing it for. He looked at the page again. The job description was, he recognized his own work in it, actually, the specific language of his 11-page remediation plan, the priorities he'd articulated over 3 days, the structural gaps he'd been identifying for years and had never had the position to address. She'd read it carefully enough to understand what was actually in it. I'd want to understand the full scope, he said. Not yes, not no, a real response to a real offer. I'd expect you to. She crossed her arms, not defensively, just the posture of someone having a direct conversation. I'd want you to read it properly, ask your questions, tell me what's wrong with it. I probably missed things. You did, he said, because he'd already found one gap in the third recommendation while skimming it. Something in her expression moved. It might have been the beginning of a smile, small and real, not performed. I'm sure I did. He looked at the document for another moment. He thought about 6 years of living inside this company's infrastructure. 6 years of understanding how it worked better than almost anyone with the authority to change it. 6 years of doing the job from a position that had never had the formal authority to match the actual responsibility. He thought about the nights he'd spent on the 14th floor, not because anyone required it, but because the work required it, and about what it might be worth to do that work in a configuration where the work could actually be sustained without running himself into the ground every 3 months. He thought about Lily asking, is the thing still wrong? He thought about wanting to be able to say no, eventually, in a way that was actually structurally true. I'll read it properly tonight, he said. That's all I'm asking. He folded the document and put it in his jacket pocket, and he walked out of the conference room and down the hallway toward the elevator. And the city outside the 16th floor windows was doing what the city did at noon on a gray November Thursday, being large and indifferent and full of motion, moving through its own concerns at its own pace, entirely unconcerned with what had just happened in a conference room overlooking it. That was fine with him. He picked Lily up from school that afternoon. This was not something he got to do often. The school day ended at 3:15, and on most days he was still at the office until well past that, Mrs. Huang covering the gap with the practiced ease of someone who had made herself indispensable and knew it. But today he left at 2:45 and walked the 6 blocks to the school and stood outside the front entrance with a dozen other adults waiting for the doors to open. And he was aware of how ordinary it was, how specifically and completely ordinary, and of how much that ordinariness was worth. Lily came through the doors in a group of 3 girls who were in what appeared to be the middle of an argument about something involving a game Ethan didn't recognize. and she was talking with the full-body involvement she brought to things she cared about, hands moving, making a point. Then she saw him, and her whole face changed, that fast, specific shift, and she broke away from her group and ran the last 20 feet. She didn't jump on him. She was 7, not 5. She was very clear about that distinction. But she grabbed his hand with both of hers, which was its own kind of thing. "You came," she said. "I said I would." She hadn't actually known he was coming. He hadn't told her. She looked up at him with an expression that was partly delighted and partly the evaluating look she used when she was trying to figure out how sustainable a good thing was. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," he said. "Everything's okay." She studied his face for a moment with the thoroughness she applied to things that mattered to her. Whatever she found there, it seemed to satisfy. She turned back to wave at her friends, the argument apparently tabled for later, and they started walking. They walked the 6 blocks home. She talked about her day, which had involved a math test she was confident about, and a situation at lunch that she described with the detailed precision of a natural storyteller who understood that context was everything. He listened. He asked questions. She answered them and asked her own. At one point, about 3 blocks from home, she said without particular preamble, "So they want you to stay?" "They offered me a job, yeah." "A better one?" "A different one. Better, in some ways." She was quiet for a moment, watching the sidewalk, the deliberate step she did when she was thinking where she placed her feet exactly on the cracks. "Do you want to stay?" He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "I think so. Yeah." "Even though she fired you?" "She made a mistake," Ethan said. "She fixed it." Lily's mouth moved slightly. "You fixed it." "We both did, in different ways." She seemed to consider this. "Is she nice?" He thought about the coffee that had appeared beside his keyboard. He thought about her sitting at the spare workstation at 4 in the morning, jacket off, sleeves rolled, drinking something that had gone cold. He thought about her standing up in front of a boardroom and saying, "I made a significant error without softening it into something easier." "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "She's trying to be better at something she wasn't good at before. That counts for something." Lily appeared to accept this as a reasonable assessment. She took his hand again, loosely this time, the way she did when she wasn't asking for anything, just maintaining contact. "Okay," she said. "Then you should stay." He looked down at his daughter, who was 7 years old, and had figured out in about 45 seconds what he'd been turning over in his head all day, and something settled in him that had been slightly unsettled since the board meeting, some last unresolved question finding the place it was supposed to rest. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right." Yeah. He called Victoria Sterling that evening after Lily was in bed. It was 8:30, which felt like a strange hour to call your employer, or possibly employer, but she picked up on the second ring and didn't sound like someone for whom 8:30 was an unusual time to receive a work call, which probably said something true about how her days ran. "I read it properly," Ethan said. "And?" "There are 4 things I'd want to change." A pause. "Tell me." He told her. She listened without interrupting, which he'd come to understand was her actual listening mode. She went quiet in a way that was full rather than empty, the silence of someone processing rather than waiting for their turn to talk. When he finished, she said, "That's fair," about 2 of the 4, pushed back on the 3rd, and asked a question about the 4th that was a good question, the kind that revealed she'd been thinking about the same problem from a different angle and had gotten stuck in a different place. They talked about it for 20 minutes. Not negotiating exactly, more like 2 people who had both been thinking about the same structural problem and had arrived at different conclusions and were trying to find the place where the conclusions met. By the end of the conversation, they'd worked out 3 of the 4. The 4th one they agreed to table for a formal meeting the following week with the relevant people in the room, because it touched on cross-department authority that required more people's input than just theirs. "Cole," she said near the end of the call. "Yeah." A pause that had something in it that was harder to characterize than the professional pauses earlier in the conversation. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the actual answer, not the diplomatic one." He waited. "Do you think I can do this job?" He sat with that for a moment. He thought about her first morning, the woman who had walked onto his floor with a welcoming party and seen what she expected to see and acted on it without asking a question. He thought about that same woman sitting on the 14th floor at 4 in the morning, sleeves rolled, drinking cold coffee, present in a way that nobody required her to be. He thought about the document she'd written and what was in it and how it had been written. "I think you can," he said. "I think you're going to make more mistakes, and I think how you handle them is going to matter more than whether they happen." He paused. "But yeah, I think you can do it." She was quiet for a moment. He couldn't see her face, but he had a specific sense of how she was holding that response, carefully, as something real rather than reassuring. "Thank you," she said. Not perform gratitude, just the words. "Don't thank me. Just read the reports when they come." She almost laughed. He could hear the shape of it even if it didn't quite surface. "I will," she said. "Good night, Cole." "Good night, son." The weeks that followed were not clean or simple, or anything that could be accurately described as a fresh start, because fresh starts were a fiction people told themselves when what was actually happening was the much messier process of continuing to exist in a situation that had changed and learning how to move in it differently. Ethan took the job. The formal offer came through on a Monday, and he signed the paperwork on a Wednesday and started the new role on the following Monday, which was both too fast and the only pace that made sense given what the network still needed. His first act in the official capacity of Chief Infrastructure Security Architect was to schedule a full audit of every software update that had been approved in the previous 18 months, which was not glamorous work but was necessary, and which revealed 2 additional vulnerabilities that had been dormant and were now not. Sarah got a promotion, which she handled with the same even-keeled competence she applied to everything and which she acknowledged with "about time" when Ethan told her, which made him feel better about the fact that it had taken this long. Kevin asked to be moved to the security team permanently, and Ethan said yes, and Kevin spent about a week in a visible state of the particular stunned gratitude that people existed in when something they'd wanted had happened without them being entirely sure they deserved it. He settled into it quickly, which was the right response. Marcus Webb was a more complicated situation. He'd been aware of the early warnings Ethan had sent and had marked them as OIs, which was not the same thing as Paulson's choices, but was also not nothing. He and Ethan had a direct conversation about it in the second week. Not a formal one, just the 2 of them in the break room with bad coffee, a conversation that was uncomfortable in the specific way that honest conversations between people who need to work together and have a grievance between them are uncomfortable. It didn't resolve everything, but it moved things forward in a way that felt real rather than managed, and that was probably the best you could ask for. Derek Paulson's situation was handled by people with legal authority that Ethan didn't have and jurisdiction that extended beyond the building, and so Ethan's involvement in it ended when the forensics team took his documentation and Dana Reese closed her interview sessions and thanked him for his cooperation. He received one final message from Reese in December. Charges filed. The address traces to a competitor's infrastructure investment group. It gets messy from here, but you gave us what we needed. Doctor. He read it at his kitchen table and thought about the waste of it again. The specific sadness of watching someone capable do something that couldn't be undone. And then he folded it into the category of things he couldn't fix and let it be there. Walter Creighton resigned from the board in December, citing personal reasons, which was the language people used when the reasons were real but complicated. 2 of the other board members who had voted against the structural recommendations came to Victoria individually in the weeks after the meeting and indicated, with varying degrees of directness, that they'd been watching and found the situation more encouraging than they'd expected. She told Ethan about this, not because it changed anything, but because she'd started the practice of keeping him informed about things that were relevant, and relevant had expanded its definition somewhat from where it had started. They worked well together, which was not a thing he had predicted and which continued to surprise him in small ways. She was direct in a manner that cut through layers he'd spent years navigating. She was willing to say she didn't understand something, which was rarer in people at her level than it should have been. She pushed back when she disagreed, and she did it specifically enough that you could engage with the pushback rather than just absorbing it. And she read the reports. Every one of them. He found this out by accident 3 weeks in when she referenced a technical detail from a weekly infrastructure summary that he'd assumed nobody above his pay grade had opened. And something about that discovery settled a question he hadn't realized he was still carrying. She also made mistakes, because she was 30 years old and 9 weeks into a role that nobody at 30 was fully ready for, and the mistakes were the ordinary kind. Misjudging a tone in a board communication, moving too fast on a vendor decision that required more due diligence, underestimating how long a particular transition would take, and telling stakeholders it was closer than it was. She handled all of them in the way she'd said she would in that board meeting. She recognized them, she said so directly, and then she addressed them. Not always gracefully, and not always fast enough, but she addressed them. Ethan watched this and thought about what he'd told Lily. She's trying to be better at something she wasn't good at before, and thought that this was an accurate thing to say about most people who were worth paying attention to, including himself. It was a Tuesday in late December when it happened, 3 weeks before Christmas. The city in the particular state of December where the cold had settled in for real, and the lights on the buildings made everything look more deliberate than usual. Lily had an early dismissal that day, and Ethan had arranged to work a half day and meet her in the lobby at noon. He was early, which meant he was standing by the security desk at 11:52 when the elevator opened and Victoria Sterling stepped out with the particular focus she carried when she was in the middle of thinking about something. She almost walked past him before she registered he was there. She stopped, looked at him. "You're early." "She gets out at noon. Didn't want her waiting." Victoria looked at him for a moment with the expression he'd come to associate with her recalibrating against new information, filing something in a different place than where she'd originally put it. "You walked to pick her up?" 6 blocks. He paused. "I try to do it when I can." She absorbed this. She was holding a folder in her phone and had the slightly distracted air of someone whose Tuesday had been full before it was finished, but she wasn't moving to leave. "How old is she now?" she asked. "Lily. 7.5. He paused. "She would want me to specify the half." The corner of Victoria's mouth moved. "What's she like?" He thought about this the way you thought about a question that seemed simple until you actually tried to answer it. "Honest," he said. "To a degree that is occasionally inconvenient." Paused. "She reads about 2 years above her level. She's decided she wants to be an engineer, which changes every 4 months, but this time it's been 4 months already, so maybe it's sticking." He paused again. "She makes better decisions under pressure than most adults I know." Victoria looked at him, and something in her expression was different from the expressions he'd seen across a workstation or conference table. Quieter, without the professional layer, something more simply curious. "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet," she said. "She'd have opinions about you," Ethan said honestly. "Good ones or bad ones?" He thought about Lily at the kitchen table saying you should stay. He thought about her assessment. She's trying to be better. That counts for something, delivered with the direct authority of a 7-year-old who had decided she understood the situation. "I think she'd reserve judgment," he said. "She does that with people she takes seriously." Before Victoria could respond, the lobby doors opened and Lily came through them. Not running, because she'd decided running in lobbies was for little kids, but moving with the particular purposeful speed of someone who had a destination and knew where it was. She spotted Ethan and her face did its thing. Then she saw who was standing next to him, and she stopped about 5 feet away and looked. Kids looked at things directly in a way adults spent years learning to disguise, and Lily was particularly unambiguous about it. She looked at Victoria Sterling with the full uncensored assessment of a 7-year-old who had heard enough about this person over the past several weeks to have a model of her and was now checking the model against the reality. Victoria looked back with the same directness. Not the executive composure, not the mode, just a person looking at another person, the way people looked when they weren't performing anything. Lily turned to her father. "Is this her?" "Lily. I'm just asking." She turned back to Victoria. "Are you the one who fired him?" Ethan briefly considered the structural integrity of the lobby floor and whether it could absorb a person if they stepped through it. Victoria said, "Yes, that was me." Lily nodded slowly, processing this. "And now he works here again." "He does. He works here in a different way than before." "A better way?" Victoria looked at Ethan for a fraction of a second, and there was something in that fraction of a second that he would have had trouble describing. Acknowledgement, maybe, or the specific awareness of a full circle arriving at its point. "I think so," she said. "A better way." Lily considered this for another moment. Then she turned back to Ethan. "Okay." She grabbed his hand. "Can we get lunch? I've been thinking about that sandwich place." "Yeah," he said. "We can get lunch." He looked at Victoria. She had her folder and her phone and her Tuesday afternoon still waiting for her, and she was looking at the two of them with the expression of someone who had seen something they hadn't expected and were deciding what to do with it. "Sterling," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you for the position," he said. "I'll see you tomorrow." She nodded. Something in her face was more open than it usually was when the building was full, and the meeting was in progress, and the professional register was doing its work. "See you tomorrow, Cole." He and Lily walked out through the glass doors into the cold December air, her hand in his, the city going about its enormous indifferent business around them, and he thought about how things that mattered usually didn't announce themselves as mattering at the moment they started. They were just the next step, and the next, and the next. And you understood what they were adding up to only later, from a distance, looking back. He had no way of knowing what the next months would hold, whether the reforms in that 11-page board document would survive contact with the reality of an organization that had been structured a certain way for years, whether the investigation would turn up things that made the building more complicated than he'd already found it, whether Victoria Sterling would become the leader she was trying to become, or whether the gap between intention and execution would close her down the way it closed down most people who tried to change things from the inside. He didn't know. And the not knowing was not the comfortable kind, the managed uncertainty of someone who had learned to live with ambiguity. It was the real kind, genuinely open, capable of going a lot of different directions, contingent on choices that hadn't been made yet by people who were capable of making them wrong. That was the actual texture of it. Not clean, not wrapped up, not the version of the story where everyone had learned their lesson and things were going to be fine now. Just people continuing to make decisions in the middle of situations they couldn't entirely control, trying to be better at the things they hadn't been good at before, with no guarantee that trying was going to be enough. But trying anyway. Because the other option was not trying, and he'd watched that option long enough to know what it cost. "Dad?" Lily said. "Yeah. You're doing the quiet thing." "The what?" "The quiet thing. When you're thinking too much and you're not here." She looked up at him without slowing down. "You're here. With me. Right now." He looked at his daughter, who was 7.5 years old and possessed, among her other qualities, the specific and slightly alarming ability to locate a person's actual situation and point at it without ceremony. "You're right," he said. "I'm here." She squeezed his hand once, briefly, the way she did when she was satisfied. "The sandwich place is 2 more blocks," she said. "I know where it is." "I know you know. I'm just saying." He looked at her. She was looking ahead, watching the sidewalk, the familiar deliberate step on the cracks, her breath making small clouds in the December air. He squeezed her hand back. They walked the 2 blocks.